All right, folks. First story is All Stories Are Ghost Stories, as written by a Rachel Longeran. I was the first one to move in when the old school was converted into flats. I happened to know the foreman of the site, and he showed me around the place when it was half done. I've seen photos of it from way back when it still smelled of books and sweat and academic nerves, when it was full of people, real and imagined. In the photos, the double high ceilings soar, flying far above the photographer's head on the wings of thousands of books, which stack floor to ceiling. Meters and meters of dark leather spines containing millions of words and ideas and fantasies and ghosts. There was a first floor walkway halfway up the wall, just a narrow, tense-looking iron thing, with a spiral staircase to reach it, and ladders on runners to reach the highest shelves. Like a library from a storybook or a dream. There were 8 enormous windows along the southern wall, so light flooded the lofty space. And there were rows of desks and chairs and brass lamps, and in the photos, serious-looking children sit with their necks bent, studying the pages in front of them. One kid, my favorite, is halfway up a ladder, reaching for a book on a high shelf. I always wanted to know which book he was after. His arm is outstretched. He looks as if any second now he'll tumble off the ladder. You would never get away with that in school these days. I fell in love with the library the minute I opened the dark wood double doors. As soon as it was finished, I moved in, loving the feeling of walking around the echoey corridors alone, loving the journey up the stone staircase, which still felt most like a school. There's just something about the stairwells that can't shake off the association of hurrying between classes, of being pushed past by older students. I loved the high ceilings and the remnants of fussy Victorian architecture, and the brass plaque signage that had been carefully preserved by the builders. It didn't start happening straight away. I think I'd been living there a month when it began. The rest of the old school had begun to fill up with new residents, some in smaller flats, carved from teachers' lounges and caretakers' offices, some in more generous accommodations that had once been classrooms or a headmaster's quarters, and one wealthy bugger who moved into the converted gymnasium, which had enormous vaulted ceilings, skylights, and beautiful original flooring. My library flat was small, but I liked it best. My library had been cut in half. I had just 4 windows along that south wall to let light in. And the wall they'd put up in the middle was very plain, stark white. They had extended the narrow original walkway out into the middle of the room to make it a mezzanine bedroom. And underneath the bedroom was a small kitchen, open to the rest of the room. And the old wrought iron staircase had been kept and spiraled up from the next to the fridge. I had a bathroom downstairs. I had a view of the sunset. And best of all, they had left the floor to ceiling bookshelves intact. So I had what felt like acres and acres of heavy Victorian wood shelves to store all my stuff. My books, of course, but also my records and my clothes and knickknacks and kitchenware and linens, plants, art of all sorts. They'd even built the bathroom around these shelves. and I had taken baths at night in the big claw-footed tub and gaze at the beautiful shelves and wonder what they'd held over the years before they held my toothbrush and bottles of shampoo. One night, I was returning home to my library after a long day at the office. I was working at an ad agency back then, and my head was filled with slogans and deadlines and nothing nearly artful enough to belong in my beautiful library apartment. So I tried to shed it all mentally before I crossed the threshold. I was somewhat distracted as I opened the heavy door, so it took me a moment to realize there was someone sitting on my leather armchair next to the record player. "Golly, old sport, who the hell are you?" I dropped my briefcase, which burst open on the floor, spilling reams of paper and cocktail napkins and old artwork. "What are you doing in my flat?" I yelled, and I panicked and choked a little on my own tongue and felt adrenaline judder through my body like all my nerve endings were aflame. All the usual human impulses upon finding an intruder in one's home. I said a lot more things to him, like, "Get out, I don't have anything worth stealing, and what do you mean, who am I?" It didn't take me long to realize I was clearly having some sort of mental break, or hallucination, or something. The stranger seemed quite content to sit in my chair and watch me as I frothed in front of him. His slicked back hair beautifully cut, suit giving him an air of extreme wealth and dignity that only seemed magnified by my panic and fluster. He told me to calm down, stood up, and shook my hand. His hand went right through mine, but he didn't seem to notice. He then introduced himself as Jay Gatsby, old sport. Mr. Gatsby didn't return every night. No, sometimes when I returned from the office, it would be Heathcliff, a strange, dour fellow. Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. He was moody. Philip Marlowe. I liked Phil. Or a relentless, optimistic young redhead who never tried of talking, even when I tried to go to sleep. The way it worked out was Anne of Green Gables, though I'd never read it. Mostly from the frequent mention of the house, which she seemed to miss very dearly. Once I walked in on Marlowe and Sherlock Holmes engaged in a combative game of chess. They were each unable to move the pieces and seemed to be playing the game via vivid imaginings, and it had escalated to shouting. I ended up dropping my briefcase and heading straight back out the door. If it was a hallucination, it was going on for an awful long time. I'd been living in the flat for a few months by this point, and my visitors were almost nightly. They'd arrive sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, from the same source usually, but sometimes, in the case of Marlowe and Sherlock, there would be a crossover event. I tried to ignore them at first, but they would engage me in conversation, ask me my opinions on whatever they were debating. And when I'd ignore them, they'd get quite upset with me. And I didn't want to anger them, who knew what they were capable of. I drank whiskey with Nick and Jay. Somehow they produced their own. I clapped for Tinkerbell. I discussed literature on diamonds with Lorelei Lee. Quite the woman. She knew little of the former, but unsurprisingly plenty about the latter. I told Rhett Butler I didn't much like his attitude. They seemed to know they weren't real, by which I mean they seemed to know they were characters in books. It was when a pleasant, chubby cat began to visit, slinking around my ankles at night and curling up on my pillow with its large, toothy grin, that I began to form any kind of attachment to them. I couldn't pet the Cheshire Cat, but he was good company, and I found his purring soothing. And the visitors, they could pet them. And I found I wanted them to. I found I looked forward to having them around, to hear their strange conversations drifting up to my balcony bed from where they tended to always sit, downstairs, grouped around the record player. I soon began to work more from home so I could spend more time with my strange new flatmates. It was always the same people, you would understand. We got to know each other. Beatrice and Benedict would bicker in my shower. Sherlock would prowl around my sock drawers. And Juliet would sit at the top of the spiral staircase, calling down to Romeo, as if he wasn't just sitting on the bottom step, looking up adoringly at her. I successfully convinced Mrs. Havisham to stay away from my lit cigarettes, my candles, and especially the oven. Elizabeth Bennet talked me through mending a button on my shirt. Clarissa Dalloway, despite my protesting, planned a wonderful dinner party for my birthday. I had to phone for takeaway. I finally asked, it was Atticus Finch, I think, what exactly they were all doing here. He told me they were misplaced. I asked him, you can say that again, but he didn't laugh. I asked Mercutio when he visited the next day, but you can never get a straight answer out of him. It was Nick Carraway who suggested to me that their Finch misplaced reference was literal. They were all from books which had not been returned to the library, when it was a library. He looked all misty and told me how he, Jay, and Daisy had all once sat snugly on that shelf over there, until a girl with red lips and honey gold hair had taken them home and lost them under her bed. Do you know where you are now? I asked. I mean the book. Do you know what I mean? I do, he nodded seriously. We exist somewhere still in that house, I suppose. Is that why you come here? I asked. Do you need to be returned to the library? I don't know, he pondered. I like it here. There's always a conversation worth overhearing. This was not especially illuminating, but it gave me a bit of direction. I started looking into the history of the school, where they'd moved to after this old place had been abandoned, who the librarians were, and if the records had been kept. As it turns out, the records were kept. The little girl with red lips and honey gold hair was an old woman now. The honey had gone gray, but the lips were still red. The eyes still filled with sparkles. She was astonished when I found her and started asking about an overdue library book. I felt quite bad. I think she honestly thought I might be trying to swindle her out of her retirement or something. But when I spoke about her old school library and the shelves and the ladders and the spiral staircases, she invited me in and let me have a poke around on her bookshelves. And there it was, tucked away between a Bront and a Hemingway. And sure enough, on the inside was a list of names and dates. And hers was the last, checked out many, many Decembers ago. I liked it well enough, she said, bemused. I never meant to keep it, though. Didn't think I'd get chased for it this late in the game. A good librarian never forgets, I said, and she smiled. Is there a late fee? She asked. I don't think I can afford it. No fee, I said, and I took the book home and placed it on the shelf where Nick had pointed at. I never saw him again, or Jay, or Daisy. I suppose that was the point. But I missed them terribly. Even Daisy, who I'd never quite liked on paper, but in person had found her mesmerizing. I suppose that was the point as well. I never tried to track down another lost book. I did not want to lose any more friends. I asked my neighbor once, the person in the other half of the library, if they'd ever noticed anything strange about the place. She had a wild look in her eyes, dark circles under them, and giggled a little hysterically before saying no, nothing strange, not at all. Why do you ask? I did not pursue it further, and she moved out soon after. I have had hundreds of neighbors come and go over the years I've lived here. Nobody seems to like the company as I do. I've been saving my money. I want to buy the flat next door and take the wall down. I can't wait to meet the characters that visit that side. Part of me hopes there's another lost Gatsby over there. I've missed them terribly over the years. We all have. I'm an old man now, and I can't manage the stairs like I used to. I'll keep the upstairs for Juliet and the rest. I always meant to fall in love, but I became stuck between the pages of books, I suppose. In that, though, I fell in love hundreds of times. I always meant to use this place for fabulous parties with my advertising friends. And later, my bohemian photographer friends, and the musicians I knew, and the writers, and the artists, and the many others I thought that could be fascinated as I was by the strange phenomenon that occurred after dark in my home. I hardly ever had anyone over, though, and I told no one. It was a wonderful secret to keep all these years. I worry what would happen to my beloved friends when I'm gone. But for now, I sit next to the record player with Philip, Sherlock, Benedict, and B and the rest, and we talk about their worlds and mine. If only I was a book that someone would forget to return, then I could stay here forever. That is, all stories are ghost stories, as written by a Rachel Logron. All right, the next story is simply called The Cowboy, as written by a Christina Mary. Death searched the desert, a moonlit shadow stalking sand and shrub. The cowboy's horse whinnied softly at death's approach, but remained faithful and did not run. It's a cool night, Death called from just beyond the ring of flickering light that warmed the cowboy's tired hands. It's about time, the cowboy replied, welcoming Death to his fire. He did not stir from where he lounged back against his saddlebags, left legs stretched long, right knee propped up, and his hat lowered over his eyes. Death was polite and settled down in an easy quiet. The cowboy was a man of few words. Most of them had gone to dust with his youth. They gazed into the dancing flames. Somewhere in the dark, a rattlesnake hissed its warning, and the two sat without speaking, in companionable silence. They had met many times over the years. Death was the cowboy's oldest friend. They first encountered one another at the local swimming hole when the cowboy was 9 years old. At one edge of the muddy pool, there was a small, rocky overhang, perfect for jumping. The safest way to the top of the bluff was to scramble up the bank around a wide thicket of prickly bush. The fastest, more impressive way was to monkey up the rock's craggy face. It was hot that day that Death came diving. As the cowboy treaded water, watching his friend Bo scramble up the slick stones, he noticed Bo's twin brother peering down curiously at Bo's deft ascent. Bo did not have a brother. Helpless in the pool, the cowboy's heart became lead in his chest. The boy, who was not Bo or Bo's brother, glanced down at the cowboy. Their eyes locked for a moment, and Death raised his hand in a solemn greeting. Nearly at the top, Bo slipped. The cowboy scratched his grizzled whiskers and took a generous swig from a tarnished flask. He offered it wordlessly to Death over the flames, and Death accepted. 8 years after Bo's fall, the cowboy and Death had become much better acquainted. The cowboy and his father were making in the rough ride home up the mountain trail when a bandit with his father's face appeared around the final bend, just off the path. Leaning indifferently against the scrawny trunk of a scraggly pine, he carved the dirt from under his fingernails with the point of a rusted blade. The cowboy pulled his pony to a halt, the call to turn back dying on his tongue as his father stiffened and clutched his chest, and then rolled off his horse in a lazy exhale of dirt. The cowboy scrambled off his mount, but Death stepped between the living and the lifeless. Why? It was time. Death placed a familiar gnarled hand on the cowboy's shoulder and looked at him gravely in the eye. Without another word, he disappeared around the turn from which the cowboy and his father had come. Under the infinite indigo star-littered sky, Death pulled out a harmonica and sang with the cicadas and the crickets and coyotes. When Death came from Maria, the cowboy cried. She had fell ill right after they had married and suffered many sickly months. From the tiny window in their rotting ranch cabin, he saw Death watching from the road, blonde curls waving in the wind, eyes blue and bright as the summer sky. The cowboy closed the hand-sewn curtains against Death's determined gaze. But Maria despised the dark and dank and flung them wide open in protest. Every morning, the cowboy would wake and walk to the road where Death had loitered. Every morning, he would say, "Today." And Death would answer, "Not today." Then the cowboy would ask, "When?" And Death would reply, "When it is time." And then one day, Just before the sun rose, death knocked at their door. The cowboy collapsed to his knees. He wept and he begged. He clung to death's skirts and he pleaded to be taken instead. Death's gentle hand brushed the top of his bowed, shaking head. It is time. Take me. Not yet. And death deserted him on the doorstep, howling at the breaking dawn. That night, he packed his pistols, saddled his horse, traded the shack for the stars, and never looked back. When death's song subsided, he tucked the harmonica away, and they returned to a contented quiet, save for the spitting and snapping of the fire that danced with the shadows. In the lonesome years that followed Maria's untimely time, the cowboy roamed the red-caked earth, fording rivers, patrolling hills, sleeping free. He tried to call upon his doppelganger through booze and blood, rope and knife, but death stayed stubborn. Despite his best efforts, someone always found him. Someone always staunched the wound. Under the battered banner of desperation, he eventually picked a fight with a hillside gang of crooks. In the midst of the cruel brawl, the cowboy found solace and strength and a desire for justice. And it was then that death, delighted to join the fun, with carved cheeks and blackened teeth. It was there the cowboy learned he could keep death near by beckoning on behalf of those whose time had come. Sometimes the cowboy summoned death with the call of a gunshot. Sometimes he made death offerings slung in rope over the nearest tree. Sometimes he delivered death in the nearest county jail. Their partnership had spanned many long years. The cowboy collected bounties. Death collected outlaws. Overhead, the stars turned and the night withered. Death and the cowboy watched the fire burn low, its sizzling embers flaring with their final breath. Do you have any questions? My horse. She'll be okay. The cowboy finally lifted his eyes from the flames and flicked up the brim of his hat with a crooked thumb. He studied the wearied, weathered lines on death's final face. He saw Bo's boyish grin. He felt his father's heavy hand. He softened Maria's azure eyes. Is it time? Yes. The cowboy nodded. Without hurry, he clambered to his feet, as best as his saddle-bent legs allowed. He tipped the flask heavenward and savored the burn in his chest. The horse's ears twitched sadly back and forth as she was brushed, unbridled, and set loose into the night. Death waited patiently as he made his final arrangements. When there was nothing left to do and nothing left to say, Death and the cowboy abandoned the smoldering circle of ash and then disappeared into the dying dark of the west with the days dawning at their backs. That is the story The Cowboy, as written by Christina Mary.